people see my success. The richest man in the world, the largest steel company in history, $500 million, 2,800 libraries, an empire built from nothing, success visible, success documented, success remembered. They do not see my failures, the investments that lost money, the strategies that failed, the decisions that were wrong, the processes that did not work, the partnerships that collapsed, the expansions that failed, the predictions that were incorrect, the judgments that were mistaken, the calculations that were off, the 1,000 attempts that failed before one succeeded, the 10,000 small failures that preceded every visible success. I failed more than I succeeded, many more times, thousands more times. I failed at small things constantly. I failed at big things regularly. I failed at decisions daily. I failed at predictions frequently. I failed at strategies repeatedly. I failed at experiments continuously. I failed so many times that failure became normal, expected, routine, just part of the process, just information, just feedback, just data about what works and what does not. This is what success actually is. Not avoiding failure, not being right all the time, not having perfect judgment, not making flawless decisions, but failing constantly, learning constantly, adjusting constantly, trying again constantly, failing better each time, learning faster each time, adjusting quicker each time, until enough failures accumulate into understanding, into knowledge, into judgment, into patterns, into success. Success is not the absence of failure. Success is failure managed well, failure learned from, failure adjusted for, failure converted into information, into understanding, into better attempts, into eventual success. Not one big success, but 10,000 small failures that taught me 10,000 small lessons that combined into knowledge that created success. Let me tell you what 10,000 failures taught me. Not the mythology, not the sanitized version, but the actual lessons learned through actual failures over 50 years of building, the real education, the painful education, the expensive education, the education that comes only from failing repeatedly and learning from each failure instead of being destroyed by it. Failure teaches you what success never can. Success teaches you to repeat what worked. Failure teaches you why it worked. When something succeeds, you know it worked, but you do not always know why it worked. You do not know which elements were essential, which were unnecessary, which were helpful, which were irrelevant, which could be removed, which must be kept. Success gives you an outcome, but success does not always give you understanding. Failure gives you understanding. When something fails, you must understand why, must analyze what went wrong, must identify the error, must recognize the mistake, must see the flaw, must understand the cause. Failure forces analysis, forces understanding, forces learning, because if you do not understand why something failed, you will repeat the failure, and repeated failure without learning is destruction. So failure forces you to learn, to understand, to analyze, to identify, to recognize, to see clearly what went wrong so you can avoid it next time. I succeeded at many things, and I repeated those successes, but I understood my failures better than my successes, because failure forced me to understand, forced me to analyze deeply, forced me to see clearly, forced me to learn thoroughly. Success let me move on quickly. Failure made me stop, made me think, made me analyze, made me understand, made me learn. This is why failure teaches better than success. Success lets you proceed without deep understanding. Failure requires deep understanding before you can proceed. Success allows shallow learning. Failure demands deep learning. Success can be repeated mechanically. Failure forces comprehension before repetition. Success teaches what? Failure teaches why. And why is more valuable than what? Because understanding why lets you adapt, lets you apply to new situations, lets you generalize, lets you build real knowledge rather than just repeatable patterns. My deepest understanding came from my biggest failures, not from my biggest successes. Successes taught me confidence, failures taught me wisdom, successes taught me to act, failures taught me to think, successes taught me what worked, failures taught me why things work, and why things work is more valuable than what works. Because what works in one situation might not work in another. But why things work applies everywhere, is generalizable, is transferable, is real knowledge, is wisdom, is understanding that creates success in new situations where old patterns do not apply. Failure teaches you that most ideas do not work, and that is valuable knowledge. When I was building Carnegie Steel, I tried hundreds of improvements, new furnace designs, new processes, new material mixtures, new production methods, new organizational structures, new management approaches, new cost systems, new everything, hundreds of attempts at improvement, thousands of experiments, constant testing, constant trying, constant innovation. Most failed, most improvements made things worse, most experiments produced nothing. Most new designs did not work, most new processes were inferior, most innovations added cost without adding value. Most changes created problems without solving problems. Most attempts failed. Most ideas did not work. Most experiments were unsuccessful. This is normal. This is expected. This is how progress actually happens. Not through brilliant ideas that work immediately, but through hundreds of attempts where most fail and a few succeed, and the few that succeed make all the difference. This is valuable knowledge that only failure teaches, that most things you try will not work, that most ideas are wrong, that most improvements make things worse, that most innovations fail, that most experiments produce nothing. That failure is the norm and success is the exception, that trying many things and failing at most is how you find the few things that work. That high failure rate is not sign of incompetence. High failure rate is sign of sufficient experimentation, sign of enough attempts, sign of proper innovation process, sign of finding the edges, sign of pushing boundaries, sign of learning what works by discovering what does not work. People who never fail are not trying enough, are not experimenting enough, are not innovating enough, are playing too safe, are staying too comfortable, are avoiding the edges where learning happens, where progress happens, where understanding deepens, where knowledge grows. The edges where most things fail, but the few things that succeed create breakthrough, create advancement, create competitive advantage, create success. I failed at hundreds of improvements because I tried hundreds of improvements, and the few that succeeded made Carnegie Steel the most efficient producer in the world, made our costs lower than anyone else, made our quality better than anyone else, made our production faster than anyone else, made us unbeatable, not because I was brilliant, but because I tried hundreds of things, failed at most, learned from each failure, kept the few that worked, and those few created enormous advantage. Most people never learn this. They try one thing, it fails, they quit, they conclude they cannot innovate, cannot improve, cannot find better ways. They quit after one failure, or three failures, or five failures, before they have tried enough to find what works, before they have failed enough to learn what does not work, before they have experimented enough to discover the few things that succeed. I learned that you must try hundreds of things to find the few that work. That high failure rate is necessary, is required, is the path to success, not avoiding failure, embracing failure, creating failure. generating failure through constant experimentation, through constant trying, through constant testing, through refusing to accept current methods as final, through always searching for better, through willingness to fail repeatedly in search of the few improvements that matter, that create advantage, that drive success. Failure teaches you that timing matters more than quality. I had brilliant ideas that failed, perfect ideas, ideas that would have worked magnificently, ideas that would have created enormous value, ideas that would have been successful if I had implemented them at the right time, but I implemented them at the wrong time, too early, too late, wrong market conditions, wrong resource availability, wrong competitive environment, wrong technological readiness, wrong everything except the idea. The idea was good, the timing was wrong, and wrong timing turns good ideas into failures. This is painful knowledge that good ideas fail when timing is wrong, that you can be right about everything except timing and still fail completely. That timing is often more important than quality, more important than correctness, more important than brilliance, more important than everything. That perfect idea at wrong time fails. That mediocre idea at right time succeeds. That timing matters more than almost anything else. I learned this through expensive failures, through ideas that would have worked later, that would have been brilliant eventually, that were correct in concept but wrong in timing, through investments in technologies that were not ready, in markets that were not developed, in processes that required resources not yet available, through being right about where things would go, but wrong about when they would get there, through correct predictions applied too early, through accurate understanding implemented prematurely, through good ideas with bad timing, through failures that taught me that when matters more than what. This changes how you think about decisions, changes how you evaluate opportunities, changes what you analyze. Not just is this a good idea, but is this the right time for this idea? Not just will this work, but will this work now? Not just is this valuable, but is this valuable today? Not just correctness, but timeliness. Not just quality, but timing. Not just what, but when. I became obsessed with timing, with understanding cycles, with recognizing patterns, with sensing when markets were ready, when technologies were mature, when resources were available, when conditions were right, with waiting when timing was wrong, even when the idea was right, with acting when timing was right, even when doubts remained, with understanding that timing is skill, is judgment, is critical factor, is often the difference between success and failure, between profit and loss, between building and destroying value. Most people never develop timing sense. They focus on idea quality, on correctness, on brilliance. They do not focus on timing, on readiness, on conditions, on cycles, on when. They have good ideas at wrong times. They fail. They conclude their ideas were bad. They miss the lesson that their ideas were good, but their timing was wrong, that they need to develop timing sense, need to learn when, need to understand cycles, need to recognize readiness, need to sense conditions, need to judge timing as carefully as they judge quality. Timing is learned through failure, through being right about what but wrong about when, through good ideas that fail because conditions were not right, through correct predictions that lose money because they were too early, through watching ideas you abandoned become successful later when someone else implements them at right time, through painful repeated experience that timing matters more than quality, more than correctness, more than brilliance, more than everything except execution. And even execution depends on timing, on implementing right things at right time, not just right things at right time. Failure teaches you that you do not understand as much as you think you understand. When I was young, I thought I understood everything. I studied, I analysed, I learned, I concluded, I decided with confidence, with certainty, with conviction. I understood, I knew, I was certain, and then I was wrong. The thing I understood was not how it actually worked. The thing I knew was not actually true. The thing I was certain about was incorrect. I did not understand as much as I thought I understood. My knowledge had gaps. My understanding had flaws. My analysis had errors. My conclusions were premature. My certainty was unwarranted. This is humbling knowledge, painful knowledge, essential knowledge that you do not know what you think you know, that your understanding has limits, that your analysis has flaws, that your conclusions are provisional, that your certainty is often unwarranted, that you understand less than you think, that gaps in knowledge are invisible until failure reveals them, that flaws in understanding are hidden until mistakes expose them, that errors in analysis are concealed until outcomes contradict them. I learned this through failures where I was certain and wrong, where I knew and was incorrect, where I understood and misunderstood, where confidence preceded disaster, where certainty preceded failure, where conviction preceded loss, through being absolutely sure about things that turned out to be false, through making decisions with complete confidence that turned out to be mistakes, through acting on understanding that turned out to be incomplete, through discovering that what I thought was knowledge was actually assumption, was actually guess, was actually hope, was actually incomplete understanding masquerading as complete knowledge. This changes how you think, how you decide, how you act. You become less certain, more tentative, more willing to test, more willing to question, more willing to admit ignorance, more willing to say, I do not know, more willing to gather more data before deciding, more willing to proceed tentatively and adjust rather than proceed confidently and crash, more humble, more cautious, more aware that your understanding is incomplete, that your knowledge has limits, that your analysis has flaws, that your conclusions are provisional, that you might be wrong, that you probably are wrong about something, that testing and adjustment matter more than initial correctness. Most successful people have this humility, this awareness that they do not know as much as they seem to know, this recognition that understanding is incomplete, this acceptance that being wrong is normal, this comfort with uncertainty, this willingness to admit ignorance, this habit of tasting rather than assuming, this practice of adjusting rather than persisting, this wisdom that comes only from being certain and wrong repeatedly, from being confident and mistaken frequently, from being sure and incorrect often enough that certainty itself becomes suspect, that confidence itself becomes questioned, that conviction itself becomes tempered by awareness, that conviction does not equal correctness, that certainty does not guarantee accuracy, that confidence does not ensure success. Failure teaches you to question your certainty, to test your understanding, to challenge your assumptions, to seek contradictory evidence, to look for flaws in your logic, to find gaps in your knowledge, to admit what you do not know, to proceed tentatively, to adjust quickly, to be wrong less expensively, to learn faster, to understand deeper, to know that you do not know, and that knowing you do not know is more valuable than thinking you know when you do not, is more useful than false certainty, is better than confident ignorance, is wiser than assured misunderstanding. Failure teaches you that persistence matters more than brilliance. I was not the most brilliant industrialist. Many competitors were smarter, better educated, more connected, more experienced, more knowledgeable, better at analysis, quicker at understanding, superior in many ways. They had advantages I lacked, capabilities I did not have, resources I could not match, knowledge I had not learned. They should have won, should have dominated, should have succeeded more than I did, but they quit, they failed and quit. They encountered obstacles and quit. They faced setbacks and quit. They experienced losses and quit. They hit difficulties and quit. They tried something and it failed and they stopped trying. They concluded it could not be done. They decided the obstacles were too great. They determined the problems were unsolvable. They quit, and by quitting, they guaranteed failure, guaranteed that their advantages meant nothing, guaranteed that their brilliance produced nothing, guaranteed that their resources created nothing, because they quit before success arrived, before persistence paid off, before enough attempts accumulated into eventual success. I was not more brilliant, I was more persistent. I failed and continued. I encountered obstacles and persisted. I faced setbacks and kept going. I experienced losses and tried again. I hit difficulties and pushed through. I tried something and it failed, and I tried something else. I tried again and again and again. I refused to quit, refused to stop, refused to conclude it could not be done, refused to decide obstacles were too great, refused to determine problems were unsolvable. I persisted even when persistence seemed foolish, even when quitting seemed rational, even when continuing seemed pointless. I persisted, and persistence worked, not immediately, not quickly, not easily, but eventually, through enough attempts, through enough adjustments, through enough learning, through enough failures, through refusing to quit long enough that solutions emerged. That understanding developed, that approaches worked, that obstacles were overcome, that problems were solved, that success arrived, not because I was brilliant, but because I persisted long enough, tried enough times, adjusted enough, learned enough, refused to quit through enough failures that eventually something succeeded. This is the lesson most people never learn. They think success requires brilliance, requires advantages, requires resources, requires knowledge, requires luck. They do not understand that success requires persistence more than anything else, requires refusing to quit, requires continuing after failure, requires trying again after mistakes, requires pushing through after setbacks, requires persisting when quitting makes sense, requires continuing when stopping seems rational, requires refusing to conclude it cannot be done until you have tried every possible way and some impossible ways and combinations and variations until something finally works. Most people quit too soon. They try a few times. It does not work. They quit. They never try enough, never persist long enough, never accumulate enough failures, never learn enough lessons, never adjust enough times, never push through enough obstacles, never continue long enough for persistence to pay off, for accumulated attempts to eventually succeed, for enough adjustments to find what works, for enough learning to create understanding, for enough failures to teach enough lessons to enable eventual success. I persisted through hundreds of failures, through thousands of small setbacks, through constant difficulties, through endless obstacles, through repeated disappointments, through continuous problems. I persisted not because I enjoyed failing, but because I understood that persistence through failure is the only path to success, that quitting guarantees failure, that continuing creates possibility, that enough attempts eventually succeed, that enough adjustments eventually work, that enough learning eventually creates understanding, that persistence matters more than brilliance, more than advantages, more than resources, more than knowledge, more than everything except persistence itself. Failure teaches you to fail faster and cheaper. Early failures were expensive. I invested heavily, committed deeply, built extensively, and then failed completely, lost everything invested, wasted all time committed, destroyed all value built, expensive failures, slow failures, complete failures, failures that cost enormous amounts of money, enormous amounts of time, enormous amounts of resources, failures that could have destroyed me, that nearly did destroy me. That taught me I was failing wrong. I was failing slowly, failing expensively, failing completely, failing in ways that cost too much, that risked too much, that invested too much before knowing whether the approach would work. I learned to fail faster, to test quickly, to try small, to invest minimally, to commit tentatively, to build incrementally, to discover failure early before investing heavily, before committing completely, before building extensively, to fail when failure was cheap, was quick, was small, was reversible, was informative without being destructive, was educational without being catastrophic, to fail in ways that taught lessons without risking everything, that provided information without consuming resources, that tested approaches without making irreversible commitments. This is critical skill. Failing well, failing cheaply, failing quickly, failing informatively, failing in ways that teach without destroying, that inform without catastrophe, that provide feedback without consuming resources, that test hypotheses without risking fortune, that validate approaches without committing everything, that discover what does not work before investing in what does not work, that find flaws early before building on flawed foundations, that identify problems quickly before problems become catastrophes. Most people fail wrong. They invest heavily before testing, they commit completely before validating, they build extensively before knowing whether the foundation is sound, they fail slowly, expensively, completely, catastrophically, they risk everything on untested approaches, commit irrevocably to unvalidated strategies, build irreversibly on unproven foundations, and when failure comes, it destroys them, consumes their resources, eliminates their options, ends their attempts, prevents further tries, guarantees they cannot continue, cannot try again, cannot adjust, cannot learn, cannot persist, because the failure was so complete, so expensive, so catastrophic that nothing remains for further attempts. I learned to fail small, to test before building, to validate before investing, to prove before committing, to try small versions before large implementations, to experiment cheaply before deploying expensively, to discover problems early before they become catastrophes, to find flaws quickly before building on them, to identify what does not work before investing in what does not work, to fail fast, fail cheap, fail informatively, fail in ways that taught without destroying, that informed without catastrophe, that enabled continued attempts, that preserved resources for further tries, that allowed learning and adjustment and persistence. This skill of failing well is more valuable than skill of succeeding because you will fail more than you succeed. We'll try more things that do not work than things that work. We'll experiment more with approaches that fail than approaches that succeed. And if you fail wrong, if you fail expensively and slowly and catastrophically, you will not survive long enough to find what works, will not have resources remaining for enough attempts, will not be able to persist through enough failures, will not accumulate enough lessons, will not develop enough understanding, will not eventually succeed because expensive, catastrophic failures will destroy you before you learn enough, before you try enough, before you adjust enough, before you find what works. But if you fail well, if you fail cheaply and quickly and informatively, you can fail hundreds of times, thousands of times, 10,000 times, each failure teaching, each failure informing, each failure adjusting, each failure bringing you closer to understanding, closer to knowledge, closer to approaches that work, closer to eventual success, because cheap, fast, informative failures preserve resources, enable continued attempts, allow persistent experimentation, create accumulated learning, build deep understanding, eventually produce success, not despite failure, through enough cheap, fast, informative failures that teach enough lessons, that create enough understanding, that enable eventual success. Failure teaches you that failure is temporary, but quitting is permanent. Every failure I experienced was temporary, was reversible, was recoverable, was just one attempt, just one approach, just one strategy, just one implementation that did not work, but did not prevent other attempts, other approaches, other strategies, other implementations that might work, that could work, that eventually would work given enough tries. Failure was temporary, was just information, was just feedback, was just data, was not final, was not permanent, was not conclusive, was just one data point in long series of many attempts, some failing, some succeeding. Failure was temporary, just temporary setback, just temporary obstacle, just temporary difficulty that could be overcome, that could be learned from, that could be adjusted for, that could be tried again differently. Failure was temporary, but quitting is permanent. Quitting ends all attempts, stops all tries, prevents all adjustments, eliminates all learning, guarantees that failure becomes final, becomes permanent, becomes conclusive, because no further attempt will be made, no alternative approaches will be tried, no adjustments will be implemented, no learning will be applied. Quitting converts temporary failure into permanent failure, converts temporary setback into permanent defeat, converts recoverable situation into irrecoverable conclusion. Quitting makes failure permanent, makes defeat final, makes temporary circumstances permanent reality. I failed thousands of times, but I did not quit, did not stop, did not conclude, did not accept failure as final, as permanent, as conclusive. Treated each failure as temporary, as information, as feedback, as lesson, as adjustment point, as opportunity to try differently, to approach alternatively, to implement with modifications, to attempt with new understanding. Each failure was temporary, was just one try, was not conclusion, was not end, was not permanent, was temporary data point in long series of many attempts, some failing, some succeeding, but none final, none conclusive, none permanent, all temporary, all reversible, all recoverable through continued attempts, through persistent tries, through refusing to quit, through treating failure as temporary, as information, as adjustment point, not as conclusion, not as end, not as permanent defeat. This perspective changes everything, changes how failure feels, how failure is processed, how failure is understood. Failure becomes less threatening, less final, less devastating when you know failure is temporary, is just information, is just one attempt, is not conclusion, is not end, is not permanent. Failure becomes less scary, less painful, less catastrophic when you know you can try again, can adjust, can learn, can implement differently, can approach alternatively, can persist, can continue, can refuse to quit, can treat this failure as temporary data point in long series of attempts, some failing, some succeeding, eventually succeeding through enough attempts, through enough persistence, through enough refusal to quit. Most people experience failure as permanent, as final, as conclusive, as defining, as proof they cannot succeed, as evidence they should quit, as reason to stop trying. They experience one failure and quit, experience few failures and stop, experience setbacks and conclude. They make failure permanent by quitting, by stopping, by concluding, by treating temporary failure as permanent defeat, by converting recoverable setback into irrecoverable conclusion, by making what was temporary permanent through quitting. I refuse to make failure permanent, refuse to treat setbacks as conclusive, refuse to convert temporary difficulties into permanent defeat, refuse to quit, refuse to stop, refuse to conclude, treated every failure as temporary, as information, as lesson, as adjustment point, as opportunity to try again differently, as data for next attempt, as feedback for modification, as understanding for improvement, as temporary obstacle on path to eventual success through persistence, through continued attempts, through refusal to quit, through treating failure as temporary, always temporary, never permanent, never final, never conclusive, temporary until quitting makes it permanent, and refusing to quit kept it temporary, kept possibilities open, kept attempts continuing, kept learning, accumulating, kept eventual success possible, probable, inevitable, given enough time and enough persistence and enough refusal to quit and enough treatment of failure as temporary information rather than permanent defeat. I failed 10,000 times, 10,000 small failures, 10,000 experiments that did not work, 10,000 attempts that were unsuccessful, 10,000 approaches that failed, 10,000 lessons learned through failure, 10,000 adjustments made based on failure, 10,000 improvements discovered through failure, 10,000 data points collected through failure, 10,000 pieces of understanding accumulated through failure, 10,000 times failure taught me what success could not teach, 10,000 times failure forced learning, forced understanding, forced adjustment, forced improvement, forced development, forced wisdom, forced knowledge, forced judgment, forced capability, forced eventual success. Without those 10,000 failures, I would not have succeeded, would not have built Carnegie Steel, would not have become wealthy, would not have created anything lasting, would not have learned what I needed to learn, would not have understood what I needed to understand, would not have developed what I needed to develop, would not have become who I needed to become, would have remained ignorant, unskilled, incapable, unsuccessful, without those 10,000 failures that taught me 10,000 lessons, that created understanding, that enabled success. This is what 10,000 failures taught me. That failure teaches better than success, that most things you try will not work, and that is valuable knowledge, that timing matters more than quality, that you do not understand as much as you think you understand, that persistence matters more than brilliance, that failing fast and cheap is critical skill, that failure is temporary but quitting is permanent, that failure is not obstacle to success, failure is path to success, is required for success, is prerequisite for success, is teacher of success, is creator of success, is foundation of success, is everything that makes success possible, is everything that creates success, is everything that enables success. Without failure, there is no success. With enough failure managed well, there is inevitable success. Eventually, through persistence, through learning, through adjustment, through accumulated understanding from accumulated failure over time, creating capability that enables success. Do not fear failure, embrace failure, create failure, generate failure through experimentation, through innovation, through trying, through attempting, through pushing boundaries, through testing limits, through refusing to accept current approaches as final, through constant search for better, through willingness to fail in pursuit of improvement, through understanding that failure is teacher, is information, is feedback, is lesson, is adjustment point, is everything valuable, is everything necessary, is everything that creates success. I succeeded because I failed 10,000 times. Failed well, failed often, failed informatively, failed cheaply, failed fast, failed temporarily, failed persistently, failed as teacher, failed as process, failed as path, failed towards success, failed until failure accumulated into understanding, into knowledge, into judgment, into capability, into wisdom, into success, inevitable success, success built on foundation of 10,000 failures, success created by 10,000 lessons, success enabled by 10,000 adjustments, success produced by 10,000 understandings, success that was not success despite failure, success that was success through failure, success that was success because of failure, success that required failure, success that came from failure, success that was built by failure, 10,000 failures creating one great success. That is the truth. That is the path. That is what 10,000 failures taught me about success.